The Denbigh Moors, or Mynydd Hiraethog, lie in North Wales. The area is home to two reservoirs, the Clocaenog Forest and the Tylwyth Moor National Nature Reserve, and at its highest point the Denbigh Moors are higher than Exmoor. Now the moors are a wild and desolate place home to various types of wildlife, yet if you believe the tales, they're also a place of ghosts and the Tylwyth Teg. A Roman Centurion apparently stalks the moors and a ruin slowly disintegrates into the landscape. Let's go and have a look at some of the legends of the Denbigh Moors in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. That was an exceptionally deep well, hello there. Basically, I've just been outside and the cold has completely messed with my voice. But never mind, you don't really need to know that. We are moving on with the folklore of moors this week, and we're going to Wales for this week's episode. And basically, the reason why I didn't end up doing Bodmin last week was just because the Denbigh Moors caught my eye, and I just decided, well, we've already done Newcastle Town Moor and Exmoor, so we'll go somewhere else for a change. And before I forget, this week's episode is brought to you Sesame Street style by the gooseberry, which actually meant anticipation in the Victorian language of flowers. But we are just going to jump right in because, let's be honest, nobody really wants to sit there listening to me rambling on. So we are going to start off with the tale of a ghostly Roman, and according to legend, the ghost of a Roman Centurion has been seen walking on the moors at least twice. Now, the general consensus is that he died in battle on the moors. He's apparently wearing full battle dress, and I dare say that also makes identifying him as a Roman centurion a little bit easier. Just as a little bit of a side note stroke tangent, I have seen a couple of people always asking why it is that you don't see any modern ghosts, and I think the main thing is, like, if you see a guy walking around in full Roman battle dress, you're going to know that he's either on a stag do, in a film, or a ghost. Whereas if you just saw someone wearing contemporary clothing, you might not necessarily realise they're a ghost. Just throwing that one out there. But back to the Roman Centurion of the Denbigh Moors. It sounds like a bit of a weird thing to see, but his presence on the moors isn't entirely unexpected, because the Romans did found the Deva Victrix fort in the AD 70s, which went on to become Chester, which is some 28 miles to the northeast of the Denbigh Moors. That is still quite far, but it's also not completely impossible to think that he might be wandering around in Denbighshire. Now, he is also a death omen because he's apparently been seen twice, and both times by a group of men, and on both occasions a man from each party died after they saw the centurion. True, 2 points do not a graph make, so it is quite difficult to say he's a death omen based on two occurrences. And one thing that isn't made clear is whether it's the man that saw him first that dies, or if it's just a man who happened to be in the party, who ultimately might not have actually seen him. We don't know. You would also need a little bit more consistency to claim he's a death omen than just two instances of it. The paranormal database call him a crisis manifestation and say that the centurion was seen prior to witness death, but it doesn't say how far before that particular death. So you would pretty much need someone to see the centurion before their imminent demise before you could call it a crisis manifestation. Still, it makes a good start. The next story is interesting, less for the ghost that's supposedly associated with it, and more just for the building itself. And if you head northeast on the A543, you'll be able to see a desolate ruin. Now, it's called Tylwyth Hiraethog, or the Watchtower of Hiraethog, although locals do still call it Plas Pren. Now, it was built in the 1890s, and the original building was made of wood, hence Plas Pren, or the wooden hall. Hudson Eubank Cayley, the first Viscount Devonport, actually imported the building from Norway. Now, he was both a businessman and a politician who created the International Tea Company stores, and he served as a minister for food supplies in David Lloyd George's cabinet. Now, in 1908, Cayley rebuilt the house in stone following the Jacobean style, and Lloyd George himself addressed a crowd from its balcony. Part of the location's attractions were its excellent views and the shooting on the moor, which helps to explain the name of the nearby pub, the Sportsman's Arms. But that isolation proved to be a bit of a double-edged sword, because while the house apparently had the widest views in Britain, it was also incredibly difficult to keep servants. The isolation also made it difficult to get goods to the house, and Cayley sold the house in 1925 when cars made it easier to simply drive to the moors rather than you having to actually stay on them. and the house's final inhabitant left in 1955. Now empty, the house fell derelict, and Ian at Mysterious Britain explained in 2012 that it deteriorated rapidly over the last 20 years. Now, as you might expect of such an eerie-looking spot, the ruins are said to be haunted, and walkers on the moors report hearing weird noises coming from the house or see lights moving around. Now, I don't want to play skeptic here, however, it is of course possible that such things do have a human origin, because obviously weird noises, well, people are well known to make weird noises quite a lot of the time, and lights moving around could easily be torches. But never mind, a lot of people do give the ruins a wide berth now, and to be fair, if they've been sitting decaying for that long, it's probably best to avoid them just purely because they'll be structurally unsound by now. But it is also hardly surprising that people would be seeing these kind of things in the ruins, given the major ghost story in the area. And a couple apparently saw a tall skeleton that glowed in the dark, because ghosts are famous for being bioluminescent apparently. But the skeleton approached them and they sensibly ran away. Now that said, as the story is told by people at the nearby Sportsman's Arms pub, I'm actually surprised that more people haven't reported seeing a luminous skeleton. Now thankfully a comment on the Mysterious Britain article about it did note that Richard Holland, author of Haunted Wales, confirmed that the whole thing was nonsense. And I think if you just simply said that you'd seen a figure in the ruins, that would be believable. Giant glow-in-the-dark skeleton? A little bit more difficult to explain. And now the ruins just look quite forlorn, really, and they're really sad when you see the photos. So I think the building itself of just, whenever houses fall to being derelict and they just kind of quietly fall to bits in the countryside, it's always a little bit of a weird thing anyway. But I think that it's just having this nonsense story attached with it obviously makes a bit of a difference. But another story from the Denbigh Moors is one of those ones where you kind of think there might actually be some kind of explanation. But there again, maybe not, who knows. And this one was actually related by Elias Owen in an 1896 volume, Welsh Folklore, a collection of the folktales and legends of North Wales. And it involves a diabolical encounter at a bridge, and we all know how much I love stories of the devil in the landscape, except unlike the Exmoor story, the devil's not throwing any rocks around in this one. So a young man lived on one of the farms at Hafod Alwy, and he needed to go to Denbigh on an errand and set off before dawn because it was going to take him a while to get there. The moorlands looked especially bleak on this dreary winter day. Now, we'd gotten several miles into his journey when he noticed he was feeling an inescapable sensation of dread. He had no idea what he dreaded, only that he desperately wanted to go back home. Fearing the ridicule he'd face if he did so, he tried to boost his spirits by whistling. He tapped out a catchy rhythm with his walking stick. And eventually he reached Pontybrenneg and decided to take a rest. So he leaned against the stones of the bridge, solid and reassuring in their firmness. And the man kind of also had an ulterior motive, hoping to see or hear someone approaching. And someone did indeed move towards him through the pale dawn light. A tall gentleman approached, and for some reason the young man felt himself compelled to walk towards him. He got within a few yards when fear seized him and he could get no further. And what's really interesting is the description of the gentleman, who wore grey, with yellow buckles fastening his breeches. 2 rows of gold buttons glittered on his coat. But weirdly, it seems the stranger wasn't actually pursuing the young man. He didn't speak to him or even pass him. Instead, he simply stepped into the nearby bog and vanished. The young man, terrified as he was, finally found himself able to move, the dread having lifted. Now, the weirdest part of the story was yet to come, because having concluded his business in Denbigh, he reversed his route to return home. And when he passed the spot where he'd seen the stranger, he found money. And even more strangely, every time he passed that particular spot, he encountered money or valuables. Now, Owen refers to the stranger as the evil one, with the assumption being that this grey-clad gentleman was the devil. Yet he also explains that the finding of values, and I quote, connects his tale with fairy folklore, as the fair people were credited with bestowing gifts on mortals, end quote. So my query is this. What did the gentleman get out of leaving valuables? Did he leave valuables knowing that the young man was heading that way, or did he leave them out so often that the young man always found them because they were always there? So there's quite a lot of questions I've got in this one. If it was the devil, why did he leave money for the young man? Like, just literally what was the point of that? And there's never any mention that the gold turns into anything else like we're going to experience in a future story in this episode. So it kind of makes me think that it probably actually may have been more diabolical than fairy related, but who knows. You can actually still see the Pontybrenneg, which is a medieval bridge near the Llynbrennig Reservoir. Now, speaking of fairies, and indeed money that turns into something else, there is actually a proper fairy encounter connected with the Moors, which was also related by Fiona Collins in Denbighshire Folktales, published in 2011. Sean Robert was a harper, and he found himself in much demand to accompany singers at events across Mynydd Hiraethog. One night, he was asked to play at an event in Cefn-Brith, in the next county. Now, it did mean walking across the moor to get there, but Sean looked forward to playing for the dancers anyway, and off he went, and he had a wonderful time because the evening went better than ever, and soon he ventured out into the night to walk home. He soon reached Mynydd Hiraethog, a lake on the moor that helped to navigate its undulations in the dark. The site is now covered in forest, having been drained to make way for the Alwyn Reservoir. Yet as Sean drew near, he realised something was very different. A wonderful palace stood beside the lake, where a palace had never stood before, and its light shone glittering reflections across the lake. Now his route home actually took him past the palace, and as he hurried along, a footman came out of the dazzling front door and called his name. Clearly that's going to catch your attention, so when Sean finally paused, the footman then invited him in. Curiosity got the better of him, and I must admit this would probably be the same for me as well, so he agreed and he headed inside the palace. People enjoyed a ball inside, and a waiter offered Sean a cup of wine, which he readily accepted. The hostess of the evening came up to him, also addressing him by name. Now, already knowing his reputation, she asked him if he would play for them, and Sean readily obliged. But far from dancing to his music, the attendees simply gathered around, fascinated by his own compositions. When he'd finished playing, a man picked up Sean's hat and passed it around the cluster of finely dressed people, and when he came back, it was full of gold. A feast began while Sean was packing away his harp, and one of the footmen kept him well fed. Now, the feast went on for hours and hours, and it was one of those kind of affairs where people just kind of drift away in dribs and drabs, and eventually Sean realised he was far too tired to head for home, so he simply fell asleep on a couch. Now, those familiar with tales of the good folk will not be surprised that he awoke at midday, lying on a bank of heather. The palace had vanished, and so it seemed had the fairy gold, which had become pockets full of dried leaves. Now, thankfully, his harp was still in one piece, so he picked that up and headed off for home. He never saw the palace again, but he did have the satisfaction of knowing that the Tylwyth Teg enjoyed his music. And he also survived the encounter, which is more than can be said for some fairy meetings. Now, our last tale is something of a sad one, about a man named Fawk Owen. And again, Collins tells a version of this, but it also exists in ballad form. Now, born in the 1750s, Fawk grew up to be a carpenter, and he fell in love with Denbigh, a maidservant who lived just down the mountain. Now, sadly, his father ended the romance when he found out about it, because he considered Denbigh to be beneath his son and vowed to find a better match for him. Fawk appealed to his mother, but she actually supported Fawk's father, and eventually they married Fawk off to a girl with a good dowry, and while he never forgot Denbigh, he settled down well enough with his new wife, Nans. Now, before you start, she's not the villain of the piece, she actually comes out of this quite well, so we'll just leave Nans alone for now. But a few years later, a hard winter gripped the moor. Supplies began to run out, and while Nans managed to make the food last, Fawk realised that he'd run out of oak wood. And the problem was, a commission was already 3 weeks overdue. He didn't know what he was going to do, so despite the heavy snow that was rolling in on a daily basis, he insisted on heading down to Nantglyn for more supplies. Having grown up on the moor, he was convinced he would be fine, and it seemed that he would be. He made it to Nantglyn and waited for his oak to be cut. So he potted around the village running errands for Nans, picking up this, that and the other, and generally getting things sorted. But while the road to Nantglyn had been clear when he set off, snow began to fall again as he left. The snow turned early afternoon to night, and Fawk soon found himself lost on the road. He couldn't see where he was going, and he was so cold he didn't actually want to stop. He just basically wanted to get home. Now, the wood had become far too heavy for him to carry, so he decided to store it beside one of the farms near Pontybrenneg. But instead of seeking shelter at the farm, he headed back off across the moor, completely befuddled by the cold. Now, days passed back at his homestead, but there was still no sign of Fawk, and neighbours went out to search for him. And it wasn't until a reprieve from the snow that a shepherd happened to stumble across Fawk's oak stash. But there was still no sign of Fawk. Some 3 weeks later, Denbigh visited Nans, and it seemed that she had dreamed of Fawk cutting hay. Not only that, but she'd had the same dream every night for 3 nights. And Denbigh was on her way to show people where she'd seen Fawk in her dream, but she wanted to tell Nans in case she wanted to come too. So they all headed off to where Denbigh said that she'd seen him in her dream. Sadly, the search party did find Fawk, frozen in the snow, right where Denbigh said he would be. And according to legend, one of the memorial cairns on the moor stands there in Fowk's memory. Now, while that story is really sad, I must admit one of the things I do quite like about it is the fact that despite the fact Dudgie's never actually forgotten Fowk and he's basically gone off and married someone else, she still goes to tell the new wife what's happened, and like the kind of, there's no animosity between them, and obviously they're really quite both sad about what's happened. And I think it actually sort of, it's a weird story in that regard, that like the two female characters aren't portrayed as being at loggerheads or anything like that. And it means that the focus can remain on the fact that they've both lost someone. And I think in many ways it basically sounds as a bit of a cautionary tale about not trying to brave horrific weather conditions and things like that. And I think that this is where the stories for this particular set of moors do sort of fit into a range of story types rather than fit in one particular template. So the tales of ghosts on the moors are pretty much inevitable, quite frankly, especially when you put ruins in a really isolated place. And strange sounds and nights probably have a human origin, but obviously the imagination can't help but run wild. Meanwhile, the legend of Sean the Harper shows that you can survive a fairy encounter if you manage to please them. Now, like the story of Llyn Cwm Clwch and its hidden island in the Mynydd Hiraethog episode where humans mixed with the Tylwyth Teg, here Sean entertains the good folk and is rewarded. True, the gold does turn to leaves in the cool light of day, but we obviously don't know if this was the intention of his generous hosts. The payment might have been symbolic, particularly because he had been well fed and looked after during the ball, so there's no way of knowing if that was a malicious act on their part for the gold to turn into leaves, or if it's kind of just what happens when the fairy illusion fades. But I do think ultimately the kind of important one, as it were, I mean they're all important stories in their way, but I think the legend of Fowk Owen is obviously the sad one. But I do think it's surprising that people don't believe that they see him wandering around in the moors in bad weather. Like, you'd imagine that that would be a figure that you would potentially see, particularly if there's supposed to be this memorial cairn to him on the moor as well. But I think the fact that you don't see his figure wandering around is probably the point of the tale, because its unhappy ending does turn it into a cautionary tale, which obviously folklore does best, and it does suggest that people avoid the moor in inclement weather, regardless of how well they know its terrain. And as I say, this is one of the things that folklore does really well. It preserves local knowledge in a memorable format, which can then be passed down to new listeners. And I always think it's really funny that you kind of have all of them and then the like 1970s public information films, which kind of do the same thing, but in kind of a more traumatising way. But there we go. I hope you enjoyed those tales of the Denbigh Moors or Mynydd Hiraethog. As I say, I haven't quite decided what I'm doing next week. It's going to be either Bodmin or Culloden. I'm going to have a look into it first and see which one works out best. There is also going to be the next episode of Fabulous Folklore Presents coming out, which I'm pleased to announce features Morgan Daimler, and I had an absolutely marvellous conversation with them as we were talking about all things to do with fairies. And if you've been in the folklore space for any length of time, you'll know that if anybody knows fairy lore, it's Morgan. So that's going to be a really good conversation for you to look forward to as well there. So I hope that you enjoyed that. As always, it's wonderful when people support the podcast by like buying coffees or joining the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon. But obviously, if any of those things are a little bit beyond you, then obviously just simply leaving a review is really brilliant, or telling a friend. That also works as well. Last thing, I am doing a talk on the folklore and traditions and so on of St Bridget's Day on Monday with Cresswell Crags, and I'm also doing another talk with the Last Tuesday Society in February on the folklore and myths and legends and whatnot that have grown up around highwaymen. So that one is actually going to be quite a lot of fun as well. So I'll put the links to both of those in the show notes in case you're interested. But otherwise, I hope that you have an absolutely marvellous week ahead, whatever it is that you end up doing, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.